Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 3, our last day of Regulatory Alliance Forum 2020, the mini virtual conference. I want to thank all of the speakers that have gone so far over the past 2 days. We have 2 more sessions today. Really excited to talk about these last 2 topics. And I am going to share my screen if I am able. So as I said, thank you so much for attending. Today is day 3 of RegAF. First, I want to start off with a big thank you to our sponsors. So Greenlight Guru, Nelson Labs, Rayland Compliance Partners, Acknowledge Regulatory Strategies, which is my company, and we host this, as well as our media sponsor, MedTech Strategists. So thank you so much for sponsoring. You guys make sure this happens, and we really appreciate this. And also, I wanted to just say we've raised a ton of money for sponsorships for next year to sponsor students who want to attend the conference live in 2021. So a big part of what Acknowledged Regulatory Strategy does, and also RegAF, is to really support students who are interested in getting into regulatory affairs and people who are interested in going down this career path. I think a lot of our speakers would agree, probably all of our speakers would agree, that regulatory affairs is a really, really cool field to be in. We wouldn't be talking about it, so passionate about it, if we didn't care so much about helping medical devices get through FDA and get on the market and protect and promote public health. So where is RegAF? Well, we are all sitting at home this year or in our offices, but typically RegAF takes place in San Diego. In the foreground there is the Dana Hotel on beautiful Sail Bay in San Diego. It's gorgeous this week in San Diego, so I'm very sad to be missing all of you in person. However, next year we will be having the conference in person, and we cap it at 100 people. We have had some registrants yesterday that came in. So be sure to go and register now if you'd like. There are a few more early bird spots, and then after that, it's going to go to full price. Again, we keep it small because we want to have sort of that intimate personal experience with all the speakers. All the speakers like to interact with the attendees, as well as and really make it an awesome networking event. So hopefully you've been able to network a little bit on the Whova app. I know there have been some technical difficulties with the app, and we're going to try and work on those if we do decide to move forward with the app next year. But hopefully next year we will be all in person, sharing a drink and enjoying beautiful San Diego. So yeah, again, go to regulatoryaf.com to register for the 2021 event. And here we are at day 3. So it's Wednesday, August 19th. The first talk we're going to talk about is remote patient monitoring. Is this the new normal? So we have Stayce Beck, who is the VP of Clinical and Strategic Partnerships at Dexcom, as well as David Pudwill. He's the Senior Director of RAQA at Convatec. So just to give you a little intro on both of them, Dr. Beck received her PhD in biomedical science from the University of California, San Diego, right here, and her BS in chemical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. She also received her Master of Public Health in Epidemiology from University of Maryland, Baltimore. She worked at FDA for over 10 years, spending time as a scientific and regulatory reviewer, a chief of the Diabetes Diagnostic Devices branch, and Deputy Office Director of Personalized Medicine and Molecular Genetics. In her branch office, Stayce oversaw scientific and medical matters involving diabetes devices. Following her departure from FDA, Dr. Beck became the Vice President of Clinical and Strategic Partnerships at Dexcom, based here in San Diego, where she still works. David Pudwill, he received his BS in biomedical engineering from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. He worked at St. Jude Medical as a field engineer before beginning his 9 years at FDA. While at FDA, he was a biomedical engineer, chief of implantable electrophysiology devices branch, that's a mouthful, and a congressional affairs specialist. He currently works at Convatec as a Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance. He also is working on a new venture called Mr. Regulatory, where he discusses important guidance documents that are released by FDA. And actually, I kind of wanted to start there for a second, David, because I'm super stoked about this new side hustle you got going on. And I've been seeing some of the posts coming out on LinkedIn. I was wondering if you'd spend just like a minute or two telling us about what you're doing with Mr. Regulatory.
Yeah, so with that, I mean, there are some people that are putting some good information out there, but especially since joining industry, every time I try to join some training, you pay $200 and it's garbage, and I wish that I hadn't spent any time on it or paid any money for it. And so the idea is to try to turn things around a little bit there, so that we can provide some more freely accessible information to people, especially in industry, but also, I think there might be some utility for FDA reviewers because as we've been discussing the other day, there's some reviewers who just don't review guidance documents. So maybe this will give the millennial generation, which I'm sort of on the front end of, a little bit more access to our guidance documents because they're arcane and hard to navigate, and even some of us at FDA have trouble getting through it. So a video might help at least get your foot in the water.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I'm excited to see the cool content that you've been putting out. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to have Stacey share her screen. And if Aaron, could you unmute Stacey? And she's going to start with a few slides. And then David, we're going to pass it over to you for your slides. So Stacey, thank you so much.
Sure thing. And I will admit I'm one of those reviewers that never really got a chance to read guidance documents, so I definitely can see how that would be beneficial because you just didn't have time. Usually you had a lot on your plate, and there were new guidance documents every other day. So thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you guys about remote patient monitoring. While obviously COVID has been a very terrible thing for our society, it has really changed the conversation around remote monitoring and forced FDA to really jump forward in their thinking around this. So they've put out several documents in the last few months. Some of these have been guidance documents. Some have been, they've made decisions through actions to different companies. I know that happened with the company I work for, Dexcom. So FDA said they don't object to using CGMs in a new intended use, which is in a hospital setting right now during COVID, but they didn't put out any big guidance or a letter to manufacturers to say that. They just kind of let the different companies know that. They've also put things on their website. So they did that with blood glucose meters recently. So they put just a little notice on the website saying that blood glucose meters that are supposed to be used in a home setting can be used in hospital settings as long as they're around used in a single-use patient. So if I use a blood glucose meter at home, I can go in and use that in the hospital, but the hospital can't use that on multiple patients because it's not made for that. So they've kind of done these things in a little bit of a different ways. As we all know, they're really slammed with everything with COVID. And so I think they're just trying to get as much as they can out and to people and make good decisions to help protect public health here. So I'm going to talk mostly about a recent guidance document on remote patient monitoring that they put out. And really this, like I said, this COVID has really resulted in sort of a complete paradigm shift, not just for FDA, but also for industry and really for healthcare practitioners. I know telemedicine is all of a sudden become a really new thing. My sister's a gastroenterologist, and she's done, for the first couple of months, she was just doing a telemedicine appointments with her patients. CMS has started to fund telemedicine. So I think they're paying like $54 for a call and $60 per Zoom. So you get a little more if you show your face, I guess. But it's really changing a lot on how people are practicing medicine as well. This really, remote monitoring really and telemedicine really allows for minimal patient contact, which helps reduce the chance of obviously infecting healthcare workers and having then the healthcare workers taking that and infecting other patients. It also really decreases the use of PPE. And this is really important. We're at a critical shortage in our company, and anything, every time a healthcare worker has to go into a hospital room and check on a patient, and if they're having to do that hourly or multiple times an hour, they're having to use PPE that then gets disposed and can't be obviously used for someone else. So FDA put out this enforcement policy guidance. So this guidance is called the Enforcement Policy for Non-Invasive Remote Monitoring Devices Used to Support Patient Monitoring During the Coronavirus Disease 2019 Public Health Emergency. So that it's very specific. Even put a year in, we're already in 2020. So I think these things are obviously are being a little more fluid than guidance documents normally are right now. But this guidance document is really intended to remain in effect only for the duration of the public health emergency for COVID. And I'm sure we can have a robust discussion about what that means as far as when is the public health emergency truly over. But really the point of this is to help eliminate unnecessary patient contact and ease the burden in hospitals and for HCPs as it relates to the diagnosis and treatment of patients with COVID and ensure other patients who require monitoring for conditions other than COVID can be monitored outside of healthcare facilities. And I think it's really important to note again that this enforcement policy only applies to devices that are already legally marketed. So these are, they already have a 510K, they just don't have the 510K for this remote monitoring portion of it. So you can't just go ahead and put out any brand new device and say, hey, it's remote monitoring, we're great here. It's ones that are already legally marketed. And these are for ones that are legally marketed to be non-invasive remote monitoring devices that measure or detect common physiological parameters that are used to support patient monitoring. And this is for those, they have a list of the ones in the guidance. I'm not going to repeat all those here, but these include things like spirometers, breathing frequency, non-invasive blood pressure measurements, electrocardiographs, and oximeters. Basically, what it says is FDA does not object to limited modifications to the indications, claims, functionality, or hardware or software to support patient monitoring for the devices listed without a new 510K. So these include the inclusion of monitoring statements related to patients with COVID or other coexisting conditions, such as hypertension or heart failure. This is for devices previously only approved for use in hospitals. They can now claim home settings, so they can make that change. Or they can make the change of adding hardware or software changes to allow for increased remote monitoring. And this could be through things that are connected to a wireless network through Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or cellular connection, and to really transmit a patient's measurements directly to their healthcare provider or other monitoring entity. So for something that is maybe in the patient's room, and in the past, they would have had to go in and look at the monitor next to the patient's bedside. They can have that be directly sent out through, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, et cetera, to a computer outside of the patient's room. And they can look there and they can even add alerts and alarms to say, okay, I need to go in and check on them when it hits this level or something like that. But it really helps prevent them from having to go directly into the room. So the way they kind of wrote this, and of course, FDA speak is always, very specific, but also not always gives clear meaning and interpretation. So basically what they said is FDA won't object to modifications in IFU, claims or functionality without 510Ks for modifications that don't create an undue risk in light of the public health emergency. And they did give some examples of undue risks. So things that don't have undue risks are if the device is intended for the purpose of displaying, printing, or analyzing the physiological parameters measured by the device, and the device is intended for the purpose of supporting or providing adjunctive, and here adjunctive is very important, recommendations to the HCP about prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of COVID or coexisting conditions, and the HCP or patient can independently review the basis for any diagnostic or treatment recommendations. So that's really saying that, these are things that are not solely relied upon, and it's very clear what the decision that would be made out of this information would be. So things that they identified as being undue risks and where this guidance document would not apply, so this enforcement discretion would not apply, is for things where the device is intended to determine when patients need immediate clinical intervention to assure patient safety, or the device is solely or primarily relied upon to make diagnosis or treatment decisions, or the modifications add the functionality to acquire, process, or analyze a pattern or signal acquisition that wasn't previously present in the device. So this is basically saying that previously there was no algorithm to interpret maybe the EKG or something like that, and now they're adding a new algorithm to interpret it and not just transfer the information. It wouldn't apply there. So really, this was a really brief summary of kind of what's in that guidance document, but I think, in conclusion, this really is driving FDA to kind of enter into the future here on remote monitoring. And frankly, not just FDA, also HCPs. I think this is really changing how healthcare practitioners are practicing medicine. It is unfortunate that a global pandemic has gotten us here, obviously, but I do think that at the end of this, it will actually have a lot of benefits to just patient care in general. They are trying to really smooth this path during this pandemic. And as we all know, the trick is going to be how FDA and others are going to push back once the pandemic is over. And I kind of put this here, but once the cat's out of the bag, it's a lot harder to go back from things. So anyway, yeah.
I was going to say also, if people were unable to attend the first session on Monday, we talked a lot about PEUAs and EUAs, and Allison Kumar talks a little bit about when is this going to end, or when is the pandemic or the declaration going to be withdrawn. So definitely go check that out because, yeah, I think we're going to be here for a while. So awesome. Thank you for the interest, those slides. And then David, if you want to stop sharing, and then David should be able to take over sharing ability. By the way, I wanted to say, if you want to ask questions to the attendees, if the attendees want to ask questions, feel free to put it in the Zoom chat box if you want it to stay anonymous, or into the Whova chat box. People will see your questions, but Erin, who's our host at the moment, she will be pulling those questions and sending them to us to ask the speakers. So, all right, David, go ahead, take it away. Oh, and we have to unmute you as well.
And you guys can mute me too if you want.
Forced mute. All right, here we go. All right, David, I think you're hot. Meaning your mic is on.
My mic is now on. I'm hot. Okay. Thank you, everybody. That was a really great introduction, and these slides just sort of to throw a little bit extra, fun and I don't know, hopefully a little bit of news into the into the conversation as well in terms of what's been going on since our last meeting. So just a little bit of history here. Remote monitoring, a PubMed search shows a curve much like coronavirus cases. Into in terms of that horrible curve that that we're seeing, and we're partway through 2020 here, and it looks like we're gonna continue to see an uptick in remote monitoring in the literature, and that really starts around 1965, where we see that the chart here says 1956, but a lot of those aren't particularly relevant, and that starts with remote monitoring for electrocardiological data, which is some of what I had focused on when I was at FDA. And we also see, there's a long history of use in a couple other areas as well, including hemodialysis. But I really think about pacemakers, defibrillators, as where a lot of this started. You see here arterial blood pressure, monitoring and these kinds of things. There's a long history of remote monitoring. And we're really seeing an explosion in wearables. And so that, I think, is also, we've been seeing a big rise in remote monitoring, and we're going to see some of that, I think, as well with COVID and, using devices like even, a Fitbit or something in unique and interesting ways. I mean, right now it gives me sleep data. But I really love this Dilbert, comic, and this is a couple years old already. But the idea is, as well, if you read this comic, I won't go ahead and read it out loud to you or anything, but hopefully it brings a little bit of a smile to your, to your face. But the idea is, in this past couple months, FDA has actually finalized the ban on certain electric shock devices. So depending on the indication and how it's used, this may or may not now be a banned device, as we see here. Trigger warning, hashtag fake news. It's not actually banned for use in people with developmental disabilities. It's specific indications in terms of self-harm and aggressive behavior. Most of those people do have developmental disabilities. And this was specifically one location that FDA has been concerned about for years, where some of these electric shock devices are used. So there are still electric shock devices on the market for different indications, but this is specifically on preventing, aggressive behavior. And that happened just in the last couple months here. It's amazing that FDA, this must have been right before coronavirus. They had everything ready to go, because everything else seems to have been overwhelmed by a coronavirus push. And then there's a big advancement. I just want to also highlight in algorithms. And I'm a big fan of XKCD. So I figured I'd throw this up here. And this is sort of a layperson. I don't know that I'd call him a layperson, but you know, even a scientifically minded person's view of sort of medical device algorithms, it's kind of dystopian. So you know, definitely you know, check this out in terms of you know, what I think the public perception is of what the algorithms are. And I think to some extent what FDA's view is in terms of the safety risks. And listening to Seth talk yesterday, I think some of this is probably closer to a view of, you know, what some of the risks are. I don't know what the likelihood of those risks are, but, you know, they're actual risks. And then just in the news this last month, Watson is being used for remote monitoring in Parkinson's patients. So that's sort of the relevance of, you know, of this. And we're seeing, you know, recent articles, and it expands a lot further than that. So there's a big push, you know, I'd say in, you know, in this space has been, and especially with COVID, as Stacey had mentioned, there's going to continue to be. And then here's just a highlight of that one guidance document. There are multiple that you know, that are relevant to remote monitoring. But this in particular, you know, I'd say is the focus of our discussion today. And maybe Stacey can talk a little bit about, you know, some of the clinical, you know, trial implications as well, because I think that's a little closer to home in terms of some of the stuff that she's been doing just recently as well. That's all I've got.
Yeah, so let's go. That's a really great point too, and I'd love Stacey's take on that because of your work at Dexcom. I know a lot of our clients have been impacted due to due to COVID and not being able to continue with their clinical studies. What's your advice for companies that are dealing with that?
Yeah, this has been, you know, something like 50% of my time in the last 6 months. We had actually had a clinical study going on in late March where we had so there's kind of multiple parts of it. There's the subjects, the people participating in the study, there's the sites, and then there's actually the staff that are at the sponsor site staff who are doing monitoring and things of all the data that's being put into the different data capture systems for the clinical study. So we actually had our staff out at one of the clinical sites, and one of them started to feel sick, to have, you know, a little bit of a sore throat and everything. And this was in an area where, you know, unfortunately they weren't quite as on top of things as in, you know, some of the other states like California, where, you know, getting a COVID test was very difficult to do. There was a lot of concern because she'd been around patients, and my patients are people with diabetes, which are very high risk for with COVID. And we really had to kind of scramble as not just me and my group, but as a company, to try to get this person back, to make sure that they were healthy, not getting stuck in an area that wasn't prepared to handle things. And that really put us to a point where we kind of said, okay, we're going to stop. We're not going to do any studies for a little bit. So we did. And now we're kind of, you know, that was when we thought maybe it would be a month or whatever. And now, you know, 6 months later, it starts to say, okay, we got to get going. But what it's helping us to do now is actually work with the sites to do more of what we call remote monitoring, which is different than remote patient monitoring, remote monitoring of the clinical study going on. So making sure that the study is being done properly, getting all the information and all of that sort of stuff. And you know, it's helped us to kind of get there. Some companies were already doing that. We weren't as thoroughly as we could have been, but it's also limiting our staff from having to travel as much as they would normally. So I think FDA also put out a guidance at that time as well, talking about remote patient monitoring or remote monitoring during for clinical studies, and really encouraging folks to do that. We also obviously have studies that are, you know, these ongoing year-long type studies where you have to get maybe blood draws frequently or do different things, and we've really had to scramble to figure out how we can do that. That's been a little trickier because, you know, some of these things have these definitive endpoints at X time, and as subjects are hitting that, we aren't able to get those blood draws. And so, I mean, FDA is working with us on that. What they've really just asked is that we keep them updated, that we submit to IRB and to them if we have any deviations of the protocol because of COVID. But I think this is definitely going to be something that we're going to be kind of battling for the future, because you know, it's one thing to stop things for a month, but most companies can't stop things for a year or longer. And so.
Yeah, I think that's the guidance documents on all of these. And David, I hope you decide to talk about them in Mr. Regulatory as well, because I feel like there's so many guidance documents that are coming out and also being updated. I don't think there's been another time where documents or guidance have been so dynamic. I mean, I just as we were entering the call today, I looked and there have been 52 that have just the word COVID in their title, and the remote monitoring guidance document, as well as I think the guidance document about clinical studies, they have been updated multiple times. The one that you talked about in your slides, Stacey, that one actually they went back, and I think based on industry comments to the guidance document, they ended up adding additional categories, right? Additional product codes that they did feel were appropriate. David, have you seen I guess, have those additions or those additions to the product code list been beneficial for your company?
So not so much for Convatec specifically. I mean, we're moving more into remote monitoring and digital now, and it's a big push for the organization. So I think it's very timely because we're taking a pretty, old bureaucratic organization, much like FDA to some extent, into the modern era. And I think that's, one of the things this pandemic is doing for a lot of organizations. But in terms of this specific, topic as well, the first video that's already available from Mr. Regulatory talks specifically about this guidance, this remote monitoring guidance. And there are a couple other things related to COVID and other things that I go into. But this is more applicable, I would say, in some of the areas that I had worked in at FDA, specifically for, hemodialysis machines and this kind of thing. And that's an area where historically, a lot of companies have been reticent to push, I'd say, to the edge of what's possible with the technology. And so there's been a lot of, advancements in two-way monitoring, but in the home, some companies have held back in terms of that two-way communication side of things, which, to Seth's point from yesterday, doesn't necessarily mitigate your risk, but FDA has seen it as less risky to turn off the software features. And so I anticipate a lot of that in specific cases maybe being turned on by companies who have that capability. And so I think it's more applicable for electrophysiology devices, which, I'd worked in before my time at FDA, and at FDA, as well as in, hemodialysis, machines, especially in the home, because of the impact on kidney health that COVID is having.
Mm-hmm. So one of the points that came up was something you said, Stacey, this not object, right? And FDA does not intend to object, or this term enforcement discretion. I think it confuses a lot of people. And so I'd love for you to both talk a little bit about that, and also maybe talk about what were the ways that while you were at FDA, if somebody had a complaint, right, and came to you and said, whoa, this company is doing something that you told us we weren't allowed to do. What are the mechanisms at the agency to,
So I think those are two things. So one is this idea of not objecting and enforcement discretion. And I have to be frank, I don't think that they've been very clear on that. In fact, I don't even know that they're super clear on that. I might have reached out to one or two friends there to kind of just understand. And even that has been a little, it's new language. We haven't heard that language before. So enforcement discretion, though, has been around for a long time, and it can mean a lot of things. You can have total enforcement discretion, which is really you do not have to do any of the regulations. None of the regulations apply to this type of device, and you can have enforcement discretion of just saying, okay, we're going to do discretion over just a 510K part, or just certain areas of the regulations. I think that the not object has not entirely been clear on what that is. When I did reach out to some friends, they kind of said that they probably mean over just the 510K part. So still reporting MDRs and recalls and things like that, but it actually has not been specifically spelled out. I think the way I would interpret that is to be safe and to do MDRs and recalls. because you don't want to, you know, come to find out that it's that you were supposed to. And then the other part of that is that, frankly, if we don't, and if people don't, and they don't, and there are a lot of them, they're going to hear about it, which gets into the other point you made. They're going to hear about it from other people, and then that really might speed the retraction of all of this. So, okay, right now we're trying to do this because of this pandemic, but you could either slowly back away, or you could slowly just kind of back into it and have it be, you know, all the time for some of these things. But if there are, you know, big problems and they're not hearing about it and then hearing about it from other people, I think that's going to really change that equation.
Yeah, and I think something that informs this as well is in the in vitro diagnostic space, where FDA has used that same does not object language. You know, and in other places as well, FDA has made clear in most of the places I've seen that language come up before that they will expect recalls in instances where there are issues. So there's sort of an expectation that you're going to be submitting MDRs in most of the places I've seen that, you know, that's come up, and that FDA will, you know, potentially be pushing for recalls of this product, even though they don't object to you distributing, you know, those devices. And, you know, so I think that's somewhat helpful. And I think that sort of frames out what, you know, you had laid out in terms of enforcement discretion being as far as FDA is not even going to require you to meet, you know, some of the regulatory, you know, requirements, whereas does not object, we're going to let certain things slide, but you're still going to have to report. You're still going to have to let us know. And that's been pretty consistent where they've allowed distribution of products that, for instance, don't have regulatory clearance. They're still expecting that you're telling them that you're doing this. They're still expecting that you're reporting. And yeah.
And 820 too. So good manufacturing practices and
yes.
everything too. So.
Yeah, I think my advice to a lot of folks that have just asked, where should I be on the spectrum of my quality system? You know, do I actually need one? And it's like, I recommend it. I think you should, because, you know, and actually this kind of goes into the next question we have regarding IFU. So I'm assuming that's indications for use modifications. Is this similar to EUA? Once the pandemic is lifted, is it expected that the company do a special 510K and or discontinue the relaxed state? And so I'm gonna let you guys answer that in a second, but I do feel, you know, these companies that already have a device on the market and they're changing the indications, hopefully they already have a nice, you know, well-defined and, you know, they are 21 CFR 820 or ISO 1345 certified, because you really want to keep track of these devices while they're out on the market. And as you change the indications for use, it's in your best interest to really have good traceability and good quality practices in place. Yeah, David, do you want to add something?
This came up in a conversation with Bill Mizell with AdvaMed, and, you know, it was more behind closed doors to some extent. I mean, a lot of industry present, you know, and you can't necessarily hold a FDA to anything that they say in those contexts. But one of the concerns is, because FDA's perspective on this has been, and one of the things we've heard from them is that they would anticipate that you would be able to pull back that software update. And from a practical standpoint, having worked on both sides of the fence, and even at my time at FDA, I think that's generally impractical. I mean, you could up rev forward maybe, but pulling out functionality is generally going to be exceedingly problematic. It's not like you can just roll it back to a previous state. There are all kinds of reasons for that, but we raised that with Bill, and I think FDA's expectation may be that you're going to roll some of this functionality back. There's probably going to be some time frames to that, but from a practical standpoint, you're going to just have to expect in your next update of the submission that FDA will review it and they'll give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. You'll have to just keep iterating towards, you know, something that'll end up being in a future submission, hopefully. That's just my take. And then just another caveat on 820, there are certain instances where FDA has said 13485 is gonna be acceptable on an interim basis. You know, I think that's more for EUAs, but you know, just more broadly, I think there does not object may in some instances cover that, but I don't know that I've seen that specifically. Stacey?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say one thing to keep in mind here is when FDA says they don't object to doing this without a 510K, I don't think that means that you can just put out any piece of crap, right? So you still want to do all of the proper testing and make sure that it works. I mean, that's not in the best interest of patients. So ideally, what you would have is you've done the testing, you maybe just haven't gotten to the 510K. Or you're implementing this into your software and you're doing the testing as you go, and you would eventually hopefully come in with a 510K to add that functionality, and hopefully that would help smooth that path. With EUAs, I think it's a very defined regulations around it and a very clear pathway. With this kind of on the fly pandemic and not objecting to things and guidance documents that are going out and being modified within days of being out. I don't think they've really worked it out. It hasn't been clear. I know, David, you mentioned AdvaMed. I know AdvaMed's been putting out some surveys and things like that to try to understand, okay, how would you be able to do this? How much time do you need after the pandemic is over to be able to get in a 510K or something like that? So, I mean, my advice to people would to be prepared, right? Don't just put it out and walk away, but really start, even while it's on the market, maybe getting all your ducks in a row and pieces together.
Yeah, fully agree with that. I mean, the plan should be as soon as possible. I know FDA is swamped right now with, all kinds of things, which we've heard in this meeting, and I've heard from reviewers directly. But the best practice would be as soon as you can submit an actual marketing application to do so. And I would suggest if you've got all the information you need now, even in the middle of the pandemic, I would submit it. And then at least you're in the queue, you're doing some of this back and forth, and that's consistent with what we've seen in the past. I mean, I when I was at FDA, we had, a number of, issues with products on the market, which we worked with, now there's more of the TPLC model, but, we were working with the, Office of Compliance at the time, and leaving products on the market while 510Ks were under review, multiple rounds of 510K reviews while leaving that product on the market. It gets really messy, but I anticipate that there's going to be some of that kind of thing happening in certain situations, during this situation where you'll have product on the market that FDA doesn't think is acceptable, but they'll probably be working in many cases, unless there's some really big safety signal, working with the companies to resolve that. Maybe not as generously as we did a number of years ago with, like, I don't know, probably record-breaking numbers of 510K rounds of review, but yeah.
David, their question just came in. What is TPLC?
TPLC is total product life cycle. And it's been a big, push since probably Dan's time as Center Director, maybe even before that. And the idea is that you follow the product from pre-market through, post-market, and into, the product coming off of the market and being obsoleted or, recalled, et cetera. And the idea is there used to be a number of groups that would focus on each of these individual areas, looking at clinical studies, specifically looking at post-market studies and compliance. And now the idea is that across the organization, you have a little bit more integration within the offices. Stacey?
And some of you have probably have a lot of experience with that, and some don't. So some of the companies that have been with OIR, they have had TPLC since I was there, which is for 10 years, at least 10 years, and before that. So what that kind of meant was that when I was a reviewer, I did submissions, I did post-market actions, I did recalls, I did warning letters, I did inspections, MDRs, all of those things. And the benefit there is then you have the same people to really see and learn from. If I saw something in the post-market side, then I would know to ask about it in the pre-market side, and also to have my eyes open for things that I knew might be problems later. So it was I personally really liked it, but that is kind of a shift now that's happened in the last, I think, 2 years or maybe 3 years now, that the whole CDRH is all of CDRH is going to that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, like seeing that from Convatec's perspective, you know, there's definitely been some growing pains and all of that. I'm still hopeful that it'll end up, you know, working out, you know, in the end. But I know there have been some concerns within industry. There are some concerns, I'm sure, internally, based on what, you know, what I've seen as well in terms of how this is all working out. But you know, I saw it when I was in DCD, you know, work reasonably effectively. It wasn't maybe as integrated as what we're seeing now, but yeah, I mean, I'm still hopeful that TPLC will work itself out, but definitely there have been some challenges and people working in areas that they didn't have familiarity with. And it led to some harrowing experiences, let's say, on the industry side of things, and getting some emails that you normally wouldn't expect to get from FDA in the context that we got them. And language means something, you know, on the office compliance side versus on the pre-market side. And that's been a challenge.
I think that's probably was a big challenge for me, you know, there too, is that we would say things as more classically trained reviewers and not quite understand the full implication of what that might have meant from a compliance side.
Yeah, it's like, you just said what?
Yeah. No, I do agree that might have happened a time or two.
All right, another question came in, and this one is a little, it might be tricky. So could you please touch on the contrast between MDDS software, non-device function, and remote monitoring functions? So for the folks,
Wish Seth was still here.
I know.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, Seth Carmody, I was screwing up his last name yesterday, but he talked about cybersecurity yesterday. And his talk will be up for day 2 on HUVA. But MDDS stands for Medical Device Data Systems, and I know that there are the software non-device function, and then there's the hardware device function. Do you guys have anything you want to add on this? I know a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, it gets complicated, I would say, and there's interfaces with all of these pieces of software, and best practice is to isolate each of those functions as much as you can, but they're all, it's a bit of a muddle, you know, in everything I've seen practically implemented. And, you know, I've seen that with hemodialysis systems, and you see that with pacemakers, defibrillators. I mean, there's a long history of this. They're different, but there's some,
I think the guidance is, it's a little vague in places, but I recommend really go with the definitions with FDA, how they define things, especially in their guidance. There have been a number of companies that are trying to, you know, they don't have an approved device or a clear device, but they might be clinician decision support software, fall within that realm. And FDA doesn't want to, you know, enforce, or they want to allow enforcement discretion for those devices as well. So I always say, you know, put together a document, cover your behind, and make sure you have a strong explanation of why you believe you fit into that category. Follow FDA's language. You know, this is one of those places where the guidance documents are there. Some reviewers won't, you know, aren't familiar with them. They might not read them, but you should, you know, and definitely understand what you are putting on the market, how it fits within that specific bin or that silo, and you know, talk to others. I think that's the other thing of, you know, I always say, don't just get one regulatory opinion. You might want to, you know, reach out to a few and make sure that what you are doing is the correct path. So, Stacey, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just trying to look up and see if I could tell if they meant and I agree, this is very complicated, and even as reviewers, a lot of the time, understanding whether something was MDDS. This was an area of active change when I was there, and I think is still going on, so it can be a little bit tricky. But one thing, just looking at the MDDS website, is, you know, is it more about the active patient monitoring versus just transferring data for use for more retrospective? So I don't actually know that answer, so I'm putting that to you guys, but I think.
And you probably have both. And then on the back end, you've got some algorithm that's going to analyze the data from the MDDS to help, you know, in clinical decision support. So it's like you've got 3 or 4 pieces probably all coming together there.
Absolutely. All right, just to reiterate, there's something that came in. I just want to say that if there are additional questions that we aren't able to address, I'm asking the speakers to go back in the next week and address any of the questions within HUBA. So if we don't get to it today, just know that we're going to do our best to answer. I know there are some from Monday as well that we're going to go back in and address. So I know we only have a couple more minutes. I want to, I'd love to just get some of your thoughts on where does this leave us now, and what do you kind of see for the future? I feel the digital health group at FDA specifically, they seem, in Bakul Patel's group, they seemed very, proactive in wanting to get these devices, remote monitoring devices, digital health devices, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy devices on the market, because they see the benefits, and I feel like COVID has kind of changed the benefit risk ratio for a lot of these devices. And the meme that I showed for this front was, in February, to get your device to have home use indications, you were looking at a big study, you're looking at a lot of time, a lot of money, and FDA, kind of opened, the gates. They kind of as Stacey said, they let the cat out of the bag a bit.
Yep.
How do you think ultimately this is going to change healthcare provider industry, FDA, and patients' perspectives on telehealth and remote monitoring? That's a big question. David, take it away.
Hopefully we have a lot of data, as we move forward. And I think that's sort of the point in terms of the cat being out of the bag. One, FDA is going to have a hard time clawing this back, which is almost what I would suggest senior management at FDA maybe has wanted for a long time, and they sort of use this as a fake because to do what they kind of wanted to do all along anyway. Not to say that that's exactly how this played out, but a lot of groups that maybe would have been more resistant to this, it's now there. And now there's data, and depending on what that data tells us, I think will drive this. I mean, because if that data comes back and we have objectively, bad things going on, it's going to change the sort of the goalposts and the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not. But at the same time, I think that overall drives the area forward, because now we have objective data, hopefully, and hopefully there's good data collection happening. I think that's at least, that's my hope, and probably the hope for industry groups and for FDA as well. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that probably a lot of industry is kind of relying on it being difficult to pull a lot of this back. I mean, you touched on this earlier about when you make these changes to software, it's not always like, it's not really, okay, we saved this one version and here's the other version and here we'll just switch back. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that the trick here is really to be able to show that there's been a benefit to people. And so for companies to try to gather as much information as they can, I think, was there a session on real world evidence? So yeah. I think there was, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't able to come. But I think, any real world, FDA is very eager to use real world evidence. And so anywhere you can do that and show that, I think will be really beneficial and potentially will help to smooth that out a little bit, once the pandemic is over.
And even if that's relatively weak, if it comes down to a decision where FDA had concerns about doing it one way versus the other, and the evidence shows there doesn't seem to be a difference, I mean, that, or there's not a big safety signal, that's been enough to change indications for devices, in the past. And so I think that's sort of where we're going, where hopefully this data at a minimum opens up the possibilities where we don't have evidence one way or the other, but because we don't, and we've got a fair amount of evidence that, we don't see a safety signal on, you can now do a broader range of things, or we're more comfortable with a broader range of things, let's say, within the regulatory space.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, and I feel, for patients, I don't know about you guys, but I watch movies now and I'm like, oh gosh, they're too close. Oh, they're in a bar.
I do too.
Oh, that's so awkward. And so
it feels so weird.
It feels very weird watching people.
Try watching a concert now. It's not even like just the rom-coms, it's like there's a stadium full of people standing up and cheering. You're like, ah!
horror movie. Yeah. So I feel that this is, long overdue to some extent. I had a a well baby checkup I have a 9-month-old at home, and I feel like it was so nice to see my doctor on the screen, and I was like, I don't have to go to the hospital, because that's, of course I want to be able to go in and hopefully, and have checkups in the future if I have to see my physician, but really having the ability to do that telehealth, or have somebody prescribe me a device. It gets sent to my house. I get trained on how to use it on my iPhone, and then I'm able to use the device remotely and send that information to my doctor so they can monitor me over, a few weeks or a month. I think it's powerful. It's a really amazing tool, and the technology's been there. It's, we just are watching the regulations change in real time to fit with the pandemic. So it's, new world. All right, with that, we've gone a couple minutes over, but I just want to say thank you so much to David Pudwill and Stayce Beck. You two are awesome, and I just really appreciate you participating in RegAF, and I can't wait to hopefully see you in person next year. Maybe we'll still elbow bump, but at least hopefully we'll have a vaccine and things will be a little more back to a new normal.
That or we'll all be wearing face shields and breathing masks.
There's an EUA for that. I feel like you used to say there's an app for that. There's a, now it's like, oh, there's an EUA. All right, so I'm going to reclaim the host position from Aaron, and I want to thank everybody for coming. The next one up is going to be about pre-submissions. So we'll see you in the next meeting. Take care.
Thank you.